Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Pinkelman, and I'd like to welcome you to Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series. The brown bags have been offered since the mid-1980s. With a couple of exceptions some years ago, the brown bag topics for the year have not been thematic. However, in light of the Nebraska's 150th celebration of statehood, the Society will be sponsoring brown bags for 2017 related to the theme of Peoples of Nebraska. The lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in the auditorium at the Nebraska History Museum at 15th and P in Lincoln. The programs have a live audience and are broadcasted on public access channels in Lincoln, Omaha, Bellevue, Hastings, North Platte, Grand Island, Papillion, South Sioux City, Blair, Bassett, Grand Island, Chadron, Sydney, and Beatrice, and are posted on YouTube. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about the Society's programs and services, can be found on the Society's new website at history.nebraska.gov. If you're not already a member, I encourage you to join. Benefits of membership include subscription to the Nebraska History Magazine and Society's newsletter, the use of microfilm reader and printer in the Society's library archives to make free copies of microfilm, free admission to the Society's 7 historic sites, discounts at Society landmark stores at the History Museum, the State Capitol, and Chimney Rock, and reduced fees at kids' classes, tours, after-hour events, and similar activities where there is a fee. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support, which allows us to tape and broadcast programs on public access television across the state and on the Society's YouTube page. To find these videos on YouTube, directions for our live audience are in today's handout. For those viewing the video, the directions are on the screen. It's easy. Type in your browser www.youtube.com/user/Nebraska Historical. Click on the playlist and you will go to the new page. There, you will see a list labeled 2017, a subsection to house the special sesquicentennial Brown Bag Series Peoples of Nebraska. Just below that subsection, you will see a subsection labeled Brown Bag Lectures, where you will find over 150 brown bags available on YouTube. Our speaker today is Gail Shaffer Blankenau, genealogist and historian at Discover Family History. Gail is a professional author, speaker, and researcher. She shares her research and advice on a wide variety of publications and speaks about genealogy and history at local, state, and national conferences, as well for the Legacy Family Tree webinars online. She is currently pursuing her master's degree of American History from the University of Nebraska-Kearney. Her topic is Take All to Nebraska, How They Came. Just to let you know about questions, Gail prefers you wait till the end unless you are just dying to ask. Please join me in welcoming Gail Blankenau.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I am going to use this, which is not on yet. And welcome to Take All to Nebraska. The overall theme, as you know, is Peoples of Nebraska. And today I want to talk about the various peoples who came here to settle. It's a very large topic. So today I'll only have a time to give you a taste of what it was actually like to drop everything, leave your homeland or your home state, and indeed take all to Nebraska. A lot of you probably know what the title is about. How many of you know what this is? Oh, well, actually good. It is the title of a book of Plains literature by Peter Winther. And I highly recommend reading books like Winther, Rolvag, Mari Sandoz, Willa Cather, because they did a lot of research and also base things on family stories. So it gives us a fleshing out of the stories of the people who came here to settle. Now, this was a book about a Danish family that came around the turn of the century, and they were called the Grimsons. And actually, it's a little bit grim, so I think that might be why he named them the Grimsons. But it talks a lot about things that we have heard about, one-room schoolhouses, and the difficulties of adjusting to a new place, a new language, and how different members of the family might settle better than others. Today, we're also going to go beyond Little House on the Prairie. Now, don't email me later and say, why don't you like Little House on the Prairie? I love Little House on the Prairie, but we do have a more diverse group of people who came here than you might think. And so today we're going to expand our view and talk about some families that might surprise you. I also want to talk, before we get too far into it, about the difference between immigration and emigration with an E. We always hear about immigration with an I, and it means that people are immigrating to someplace. Immigration with an E, I was taught many years ago, means they're emigrating from someplace. So from Denmark, they're an immigrant with an E. However, the literature of the time period, starting in the 1850s up, they refer to themselves, no matter what, as immigrants with an E. So when you see some of the things that I have up on the screen, just know that we need to, as historians, know how people referred to things at that time so that we understand what we're doing. How did they come? Well, I think most of us know at least some of the ways that they came, but we even have a magazine called The Prairie Schooner here in Nebraska because covered wagon was one of the ways. And interestingly, did you know that self-help books are not new? Because here's all the stuff you have to bring for your wagon. And there's this long and I think really daunting list of things that you should bring with you when you're coming, including little things that the Indians might want to buy from you. So in addition to all this, though, just in case people might get too discouraged, they still are boosting it, and it's going to be a wild and interesting excursion. Do you think that people were really ready for what they encountered when they got here? Here's how some people's Western adventure went. The stories of the Oregon Trail are replete with what was left behind, including there are probably 1,000 or more unmarked graves along the Oregon and the Mormon trails of Nebraska. They also, of course, came by water, and as you know, Nebraska has the Missouri River going along its east border and up into the northeast as well. And then we're bisected by the Platte, which then splits into the North Platte and the South Platte in the west. This is a reproduction barge or keelboat that fur trappers would use, and you could see that you could traverse maybe in the Niobrara and some other places, not just the Missouri. The Lewis and Clark expedition used this kind of keelboat on their travels. But steamboat was even more important in the settlement of Nebraska. Out in our you can buy this diary of Molly Dorsey Sanford, and I love this. She talks about arriving to Nebraska City to the boom of artillery, and there were crowds of people. And think about it, back then, you know, what did you do for fun? Well, I guess you went down to the docks to see who was getting off the steamboat. But she found her steamboat trip to be very pleasant. She was an outgoing and very lively girl. But when she did take a wagon across Nebraska several years later, that she thought was hard. So we'd rather go by steamboat, I guess, than wagon. Many of our earliest pioneers came by wagon and boat, but more came on trains. And I don't think I can emphasize too much the role that the railroads played in the settlement of this state. And before we became a state. The first railroad was completed by CB&Q, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, in 1867. It wasn't one that completely went to the west, but it was called a complete line. And this particular map that you're looking at is showing the land grants that Union Pacific received. Over 16% of Nebraska's land mass was granted from the government to the railroads, who then turned around and sold it to settlers. Now, they didn't try to make a big profit on it. You know, they might have been tempted to do that. But what they wanted to do was really bring people here for the long term and to produce crops and have little towns that they could then have a long-term profit from doing the transportation of people and produce. We have some push factors of immigration, and a lot of you might know about this. We always want to know, why did so-and-so come here? Why did they choose Nebraska? And unless they left a diary or some sort of account, we can't really know. All we can do is look at what groups of people were doing and see if we can extrapolate for there. And this is, of course, a slide showing the potato famine in Ireland, but a lot of people don't know. We had a potato famine in continental Europe as well, and also in Britain. So a lot of what we know, we need to kind of expand our thinking on. Another commonly thought of push factor is religious persecution. And we might here in Nebraska think that that didn't have too much to do with our history, because most of that was earlier in the settlement of British North America. However, I do want to remind you that Mormons were persecuted, and they have the Mormon Trail. Of course, they were headed to Utah, but a lot of them did stay. And we also had Germans from Russia, some of whom were starting to be persecuted during the 1870s when that government, they used to have a lot of exemptions for religion, for language, and for military service that was lifted in the 1870s, which prompted another big wave of people to come here and some other places in the Midwest. But we have a lot of Germans in Russia, from Russia here in Nebraska. We also have political things that were happening. There was a revolution and riots taking place in Germany, Austria, Austro-Hungary, parts of France in 1848 through 1850. And when that got tamped down, some people were truly coming as refugees. They were afraid that if they realized that they had taken part in this, that they would be arrested and jailed. Pull factors for Nebraska, classic. The federal land acts were probably the biggest pull factor for us. As land opened up, it presented opportunities for people to own land. And we tend to think of the Homestead Act most. It was passed in 1862, and the first time you could file was January of 1863. But we also had other important acts like the Preemption Act. People came here before the Homestead Act. And if you settled here, and some people might say squatted here, you had a preemption right. You could buy that land before anybody else could get their mitts on it. And we do have a few interesting stories about people preempting and people being carried out of their houses. And, you know, people got a little bit angry about some of these things. We also had boosterism, and with that, advertising. So once you settled someplace, you wanted your spot to be prosperous and you wanted more people to come. You would start a newspaper, you would advertise, and there were also letters home saying, come settle by us. And this led to a real strong trend of chain migration, which we will talk about in some of the examples I have today. I like to look at immigrant handbooks because it tells me what they're being told and what people are thinking in their decision-making process. In 1848, Nebraska opened for settlement in 1854, and the first land office opened in 1855. In 1858, you can see that this immigrant handbook gets you as far west as Iowa, and then it talks about the Western Territories. And as you look at it, they're saying, well, we're not even going to start to talk about those because it'll be a long time before anyone thinks of going there. Not even a decade goes by and people are pouring into Nebraska territory. So I like to quote Yogi Berra a lot because he's so fun. And on this one, what comes to mind is it's really tough to make predictions, especially about the future. And I think this immigrant handbook author really had a tough time with his predictions. So the advertising, a lot of it was done by railroads. And here we see, look at that beautiful picture. Does that not look like I want to live there, wherever it is? Where is that? And they supplied these brochures and things for free. And they also advertised in several languages. The railroads opened up offices all over Europe. They were in Polish, Czech, Swedish, Danish, Hungarian. They have all of these things, and they are also providing freight and family discounts. Is this starting to sound kind of modern? And do we have a deal for you? Make sure that you have those soldiers coming because they can get theirs with less time. You get credit for time served in the Civil War. So come, homes for the homeless. And I love it, the generous government of the United States of America. And who did this one? The state superintendent of immigration in Omaha, Nebraska. Newspapers, of course, got in on the act. This is an 1871 front page showing how Nebraska City is really the place to be. Look at all the railroads coming to and from, and then they're by the river. This is the perfect place. And it really was a terminus for people to start. They would come there and then buy a wagon there and start overland. We've come to the case study part, and this is usually the part that people love best, but I still wanted you to have a little bit of the background of why people were coming here and how they were encouraged to come. I'm going to start with early settlement. Before we were actually formally open for settlement, a lot of French fur trappers and fur trappers of other ethnicities came, and they actually settled. And métis is a French word for mix. And these were usually settler men and indigenous women. And they would form these alliances for business reasons, but also family reasons. And they formed very strong bonds and actually settled here. So they were here before, talk about a preemption right. They were here before, we were even supposed to be settled. Fontenelle Post, 1833 is the oldest continuous settlement in Nebraska. And Fontenelle did marry an indigenous woman, and many of the fur trappers followed that lead. So today we're going to talk about a particular family. It's Jean-Baptiste Fleuret and his wife, Margaret Strikes the Ree. Margaret was a Yanktonais of the Sioux tribe. And they don't like to really be called Sioux, so I'll try to stick to Yanktonais. And some of the first people to so this was one of those classic ones where they intermarried for business reasons because Jean-Baptiste Fleuret was a French fur trapper. She was the widow of another fur trapper called Narcisse Frenière. And they got married. After their Indian marriage, they had a child, and then they got married in 1857 in Iowa. But if a river runs through it, they're going back and forth. So just know that if you have ancestry in Iowa and Nebraska, if a river runs through it, it's easier to cross the river than to court somebody 80 miles north of you. So if you're not finding records where you think you should, think about the rivers. It's very, very important. Where did the Fleurets end up in Nebraska? They were part of the Nemaha land tract. And you can see at the very lower southeast corner, that yellow spot, and then there's a green spot. It's kind of an oddly shaped tract. But this was not for full-blood indigenous people or for French fur trappers. It was for people of mixed heritage. Now, the original land allotments were for people of the Oto tribe only, but the Yanktonais, the Santee, the Iowa, and the Omaha bands paid the Otos for the right for their mixed heritage descendants to settle there as well. Obviously, when Marguerite married Jean-Baptiste, they had some children who were eligible as Yanktonais, half and Yanktonais, to settle there. And at the Nebraska archives, we have some of these settlement records, and you see the allotment for Louisa Fleuret. It actually says Fleur. They're always having trouble. What do we call these people? And Louisa was 13 when she got her allotment. Her brother was 8. And their father, Jean-Baptiste, was the one doing the paperwork for them. Not long after, she came to Nebraska to settle, and she married another fur trapper, Louis Phillips, who was an Anglo-American from New York. And you can see that most of their children were born in Nebraska, but the last one in Iowa. Again, crossing the river, going back and forth to their extended family. At the very bottom, I don't know if you can see, but you can see that Jean-Baptiste is living with his married daughter now, and he was born in Canada. So Marguerite is still alive, but they're not living together. Some of them, however, went up to the Crow Creek Reservation, where Yanktonais also had rights to a land allotment. And you can see that her brother John, Louisa's brother John, is there at the Crow Creek, and I have a red arrow to him. Right above him, do you see Mrs. Kirky? That's Marguerite Strikes the Ree. I call her Much Married Margaret, because this was the 4th marriage, and she's listed as a full-blood Yanktonais. So they all went up there for more land. So land's always a draw. The next family I'd like to talk to about is from Ireland. And I'm going to talk about them quite a bit because I could document exactly how they got here. And for all of these families, I have way more to say, but not enough time to say it. This is the Johnson family, and Edward Johnson was the patriarch, and they came to Nebraska very early. Now, first they had to cross the pond, and they came by boat in 1853 to Philadelphia, and they stayed here. A lot of our ancestors who settled here have an intermediate settling spot. It's a place where maybe they make some money so they can buy some land, or make money so they can buy what they need to settle. Or if they are from another country, they will often settle somewhere where their native language is commonly spoken. There are others there. And then as land opens up west, they head out because they're ready to go. And that's what this family did. And here's Edward. And you can see he's accompanied by his older mother, Jane Johnson, and she's a widow, and he also has a little brother with him, Thomas. Now, other people had come before them, and other people came after them, so this is a classic case of chain migration from Northern Ireland to the United States. And you can see on the side it says Londonderry, and that's where they left Ireland. You can follow them in Philadelphia city directories, and I follow them, and guess what? There are lots of Edward Johnsons in there, and I looked under Johnston. There weren't any Edward Johnstons, but a good genealogist or historian would look under both. I followed them throughout the 1860s, and the brickmaker, ship joiner, and teacher were still there, but the porter disappeared. So I'm pretty sure that that's the Edward Johnson that came to Nebraska. The family story says that they went by rail to Monmouth, Illinois, where his brother Michael was living, and that looks correct, and you can see how the railway system was so important. Then he took the railroad to Des Moines, and from Des Moines he had to walk. So that is an amazing walk. He walked from Des Moines, looked at the trees at Elmwood Park around Omaha, present day, and said, this isn't good enough. And he went to present-day Dodge County, and this is Maple Creek. And I actually went there. This picture is where the dugout was. I went there with one of the descendants. It's still in the family, and that's where he just dug a hole in this riverbank and lived there. And his brother Michael joined him there too. There are more stories, including some encounters with natives, but we don't have time. I just want you to know there's more. You also want to be a good researcher. Are these family stories correct? And in this case, it kind of looks good. This is the 1860 territorial census, and there are Edward and Michael living, probably not in the riverbank anymore, but they're going to do a preemption, both of them. Their first land acquisition here is because they squatted, and then when the land opened up, they were ready and they had their preemption patent. They also said he went back to Philadelphia to get his wife, and guess what? He did. And you see that Edward is a farmer in Nebraska in 1863, and he's marrying Catherine Scott. So we can assume that the family story is pretty good and that he at least has a fairly nice shelter. Catherine was not going to live in the riverbank. He also did a homestead entry. A lot of people don't think there's just one way to get land. He did the preemption, and then he cast about and he did a homestead entry in 1866. He says that he has a wife and 4 children, so he's been here a while. And when he proves up, of course, you have to say, these are all the improvements we made. I can't go through all the improvements, but these are great records because you can see how they started with a little cabin and then they kept adding on, and you can kind of get a sense of what it was like. I had one where they had 9 children in a 16 by 20 dwelling. 9 children. He proved up in the 1870s, and he kept acquiring land. They settled in the Purple Cane District. I like to look at federal tract records too, because then you get an idea of the neighborhood. And guess what? The neighbors are often related or in the same kinship or religious group. So again, you can start to get an idea of more context of how they lived. You know, we like to say these individuals came out west and did things all on their own. Usually they're in these groups, and they're support groups, and this will help you to succeed. Only 40% of people who started a homestead ended up proving up and getting that patent. This was not for the faint of heart. This family leveraged the land acts, and they also purchased cheap railroad land. And notice how they started to settle as close to one another as possible. And today, this family still has large land holdings in Nebraska, and they started out poor as church mice, working in the factories of Philadelphia. So that was the Johnson family. Let's go on to the largest ethnic group that settled here, and that was the Germans. The bulk of them came in this time period, but in Nebraska, they kept coming well into the 20th century. I like looking at maps and guides. You probably figured that out already. And here's one dated 1853, and it shows how they would maybe take a trail or a railroad to a port, and depending on which port they arrived in, the route they took on there. Now, this is an immigrant guide saying this is what you can do and this is how much it's probably going to cost. And it's another guide that's in German saying, and you need to bring this, this, and this, but don't bring clothes or very many clothes because clothes here are cheap. In 1853, look where Nebraska is. It says Indian Territorium. So people who left around this time period didn't have Nebraska on their radar screen. Germans who came fairly early probably went to Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, and then, just as the Irish people did from Philadelphia, kind of got their feet wet and then came west, usually in a group. Notice what the 1866 one says, though. It's in German, and it's again, come to Nebraska, there are all these wonderful things, and there are a lot of Germans here already in 1866. So who came? Here's an example of one who came very early to the United States. Her name is Mary Myers, and she is so early on the ground. She's an interesting person. She initially came with her husband and a couple of children, and they settled in Wisconsin. They came, and they're in the 1860 territorial census, and her husband's still alive. He's doing freighting to gain money, so when they've already squatted on the land, and they want to get the money because you're going to have to, even if you get the land for free, you've got all these improvements you have to make. He dies. So she just goes ahead and does it on her own. They were from a place called Muhlenbach, and I like to look at where people were from. Can you imagine what she thought when she arrived in Gage County, Nebraska? This is Hilly. She had worked as a vine dresser in the fields, and here we are in Nebraska, and what are we going to plant? What are we going to do? But she was undaunted, and she was application number 20, so 19 people after Daniel Freeman, the first homesteader. And she's really interesting. January 20th, 1863, number 20, and she proves up 5 years later to the day. Now, when she applied, she signed by Mark, but 5 years later to the day, she signed with a German script. So in between getting the houses built and planting and doing all these things, she learned to write her name, and I like to think it's so that she could sign this patent. She also signed the patent for her son-in-law in the same hand. I could say more about her, but I'm moving along to Scandinavia, which was this was the second largest ethnic group that came. If you split them between Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, yeah, it gets a little smaller, but if you put them all together, this is the next largest number. Let's talk about Peter Christian Peterson. I won't get into patronymic naming, but this can get really interesting to do Danish or Swedish research. He was from Denmark, and he married a woman named called Carrie, and she was Karen Marie Price. They're both Danish. So how do we find out about when and how he came? Well, he said consistently in censuses that he arrived in 1884. Censuses are sometimes wrong, so you need to keep going, but we have a good idea. Look, he is also with his wife, and he has some stepchildren, and they were born in Wisconsin. So we see that she settled first in Wisconsin and had a couple of children. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then they get married, and they have Frederick. To really track him, you need to find out who his parents were and find out more about him. So I pulled the Nuckolls County marriage record for him at the Nebraska Archives. And you can see that his parents are Nels Peterson, and thank goodness, a not as common name, Rebecca Nuttall. And it turns out that they were actually Germans from the Holstein region. That Danish part, they fought over that region for generations. Could go on to that too. So knowing that helps me to now go to this great website called danishfamilysearch.org, which is free, by the way. And you see that I have a man who's a match to the birth date and a man who matches the parents' names, and there's a Rebecca Noodle, so I know that it is correct. But what I'm really looking for is where he's from. And it says Vejle at the top of this record. And if you go to the records that are at the same Danish website, these are the records that Danes and Germans and Swedes had to write there to tell them that they were actually leaving and going to a new country. And although there are lots of Petersons leaving, only one, thank goodness, was from Vejle. And so now I know I have the right guy, and I know I have the date of when he left. And he left on the 8th of May, 1884. So he was right. He came in 1884. I'm then able to find his arrival record in New York Harbor. He came on the Hekla, and you can see how long it took. He arrived on the 30th of May, 1884. So that's how he came, steamships. So were those steamships nice places? Not for him. He was in steerage. This was not the Titanic where they had ballrooms, although the Titanic had steerage too. But he wasn't in the ballroom. He was in steerage where it was crowded and stinky and hot, and a lot of people got sick. It was not a nice way, but at least it was shorter than it was in the 1600s to come across. This family had echoes of Sarah Plain and Tall. Remember how his wife was married before? He put an ad in the Danish newspaper from Omaha and asking for a housekeeper. which is really a euphemism for come help me because I don't like batching it, and if you like me, you can marry me. And she did, and they did. So that was that story. And again, I have more, but I have another really important family to talk about. Here is an African American family that came to settle here. And John McWilliams also went by John Mack. And I found some great stuff on him as well. He was born around 1847. We do not know exactly. He was an enslaved person. And he died in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1917. I first can document him in the Missouri Provost Marshal's records, for purpose of this anyway, where he is enlisting to be in the Civil War. There was a General Order number 135 where you could earn your freedom by fighting for the Union, and so he signed up. This record gives the name of his slave owner. So if you're doing African American research, this document is golden because that's how we make progress on this particular family. I have so much more to say, but I'm going to have to move on. But that's where he goes, and he does fight. Now, I wanted to point out, he says he's 18 here. And that matches a story that appeared in the Lincoln paper because they did some interviews for this family. And he had said that he went up and they said, "You look a little young, how old are you?" And he said, "Well, how old do I have to be?" And they said 18. He goes, "Well, that's what I am." And notice how he said he was 18 on there? So these stories are great. And that was a picture of his wife that appeared in the newspaper as well. They had to be emancipated in another way. It was only men who could fight, who at that time could earn their freedom. He also did another registration, and I believe this Thomas Ashford paid him to fight as his substitute as well. So he probably got a signing bonus from the provost marshal who was really wanting people to come, and then this Thomas Ashford paid him as well. And all the men in this particular part of the list are former enslaved people. He's in the Civil War Pension Index. I actually looked for the pensions. Oh, I wish they had been in Washington, D.C. when I was there. But these particular pensions were transferred to St. Louis. But you can see he served in the Kansas regiments. And these are actually the same regiment with different names. But he served the whole 3 years, and he was a corporal. He was John Mack, too. Did you notice? He was John Mack when he was serving. So I had to estimate their marriage. It might be in that widow's pension, but I had to estimate the marriage from where, and when the children were born. And they are in Doniphan County, which is right by the fort where John served in the Civil War. And you can see that they've started their family and all is going well. And by 1885, they've gone to Nebraska. Now, in 1870, he was listed as a peddler and a preacher. And their religious faith was really important to them. In 1885, they're in Falls City, and he's still working as a minister. Now, just to show you the area, I'm not sure whether as a peddler he had a wagon that they took up or whether they used the river. I suspect probably a little of both. They probably went up the river and then debarked with the cart. You could bring your cart onto some of these, and then he went to Falls City. But they did not stay there long, and how I know that is by one of the children said he was born in Lincoln in 1888. So by 1888, they're here. The 1890 census, of course, is burned, but we next find them at this particular address in Lincoln, Nebraska. He's still preaching, but he's a lay preacher, and he's also working as a hall janitor. One of the boys is working as a barber and a porter, and the children who are still of school age are attending school. And they became big, very, very prominent in the African American community. And Sarah was called an honorary preacher herself. So she preached in the Christian church here in Lincoln, Nebraska. And their descendants still live in this area and in Omaha and other places too, but we still have this family here that came so early. They had a family story about homesteading, and that's one of the other things we have to do is sometimes we prove things and sometimes we disprove things. There was a John McWilliams in the area, but he didn't match John McWilliams, so he didn't homestead, and that's part of the fun. Last but not least, I want to talk about the Latino people who came into this area, and some of them came surprisingly early. I'm from western Nebraska, so I probably knew a little bit more about this, but those who are from the east may not be aware. A lot of families came, particularly to the east in Omaha, but also to the west to the sugar beet fields. A few years ago, Scottsbluff opened up a museum of Mexican-American heritage, and there was a traditions project through the Historical Society, and one of the people they interviewed was this Benjamin Castañado Jr., and I love this picture. He's holding a really cool picture of his father, who was the immigrant to Nebraska. I found his father as Benjamin Roja Castañado y Roja. Roja, that y Roja means that his mother's maiden name was Roja. And I love to do research on Hispanic families because the names really point to things because they honor the women. So that was his baptismal and birth record. And these records are incredible. They give all sorts of information. They're much better than American civil registration. The birth date on that record matched the birth date that he provided when he registered for the draft here in Nebraska. And notice that he uses his middle name as Roja. So he's here, he's registering for the draft, and several of the children did end up serving our country from Nebraska. Now, one of the family stories about the man in that really cool picture was that he's fought with Pancho Villa. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but he said that's why they came, because of course there was the Mexican Revolution. That's a push factor, isn't it? Mexican Revolution, and then it doesn't really work out, so maybe I need to hightail it someplace else. It's plausible, but I went and said, well, when did he get married? And he married Otila Martinez in 1914 in Torreon. And actually this area, Coahuila State in Mexico, is one of the places where Pancho Villa did a lot of his recruiting for his army. But would a family man serve? How would Otila feel about that? Well, an American film company was invited to come and film Pancho Villa in 1914, so we have all these images, and the families were indeed following. So I haven't ruled it out. But what we do know is he crossed the border in October of 1914, and we have these border crossing records that I found on Ancestry.com. And although the photo on there, you can, if you really look closely at the photo that Benjamin Jr. has, it's definitely him. But we also know it's the right man because as you can see to your left, who's his wife? Otila Martinez. And he has a son, Jose, later known as Joseph. And also crossing the border with them was Juan Rubio, who is a nephew. This is 1918. By 1920, I find them in Fairfax, Oklahoma, and there are 2 whole pages of census records. Always look at what's happening on the whole census record, not just your people. They're all from Mexico, and they're all working on the railroad. So that's how they came, and you see they've had one more child, and he was born in Oklahoma. So where does Nebraska come in? Actually, pretty soon. But I want to take a step back and talk about what brought them here, maybe besides Pancho Villa. There was an Immigration Act of 1917, and for all ethnicities, it imposed a tax, taxes. And it had a literacy test, interesting. And if you were illiterate, they didn't really want you to come over. And they wanted you to really want to come here and stay, so you paid this tax. Well, what else was going on at that time period? World War I. Was there a shortage of people to work? Absolutely. So not surprisingly, as often happens today, business interests such as agriculture, mining, and railroads lobby Congress, and lo and behold, just the next year in 1918, there's a waiver, particularly for Mexican workers. So this is a picture of Mexican workers being taken by the railroad out to the sugar beet fields. So we find them in 1930 in the place where the family still lives today, and I know some of these people. I was in swing choir competitions with some of them. And, and we called it swing choir back then. Now it's show choir. Anyway, the Castellanos are from Mitchell, and they are working both on the track temporarily and then in the sugar beet fields. Now, this early, the Castellanos are one of the first Latino families to settle there. There are a lot more in the 1940 census, so that chain migration keeps going. But they're surrounded by Germans from Russia who are also working in the sugar beet fields. So very interesting how that all came together. When did they get here? About 1921, because remember, they were in the 1920 census in Oklahoma. So we've gone through a lot of families in a little bit of time, but I think you're starting to see that we have some very common themes, because no matter how or when or even why they came, land was a draw, the railroads did a lot of promotion, and the railroads recruited down in Mexico actively for people to come and work. Whether they were a homesteader or they came and worked on the track or the sugar beet fields, they were very diverse in their origins and diverse in their language. But what did they come for? They came for a better life. And if I can say it, because I was born in Nebraska myself, they came for Nebraska, the good life. Thank you. And we have time for questions, I think. Any questions?
You talked about the resources here, the State Historical Society,
Mm-hmm.
finding the history. Do you do classes on that?
Okay, I'm repeating her question. I talked about some of the resources we have at the Historical Society, at the archives. And she asked if we do classes on that. They actually, when you go there, they'll give you a little tour and orientation to the main things, and they'll ask you exactly what you're interested in doing. I also do give classes at various conferences and things. One of our other people was at the genealogy day last week, and I talked about genealogy there. And that was more genealogy. John Stroop wanted me to do more history, but of course you noticed I stuck some genealogy in. But yes, also at the public library, they have a free edition of Ancestry.com. So if you don't want to pay the subscription that I pay, you can go to the library and use that. I also go to Union College Library, has a lot of genealogy books. But if you are looking at Nebraska things, you need to go to the archives. And the newspapers, oh my gosh. They're just great stuff. A lot of what I had from McWilliams, too, came from newspapers. I could have gone on and on about any of these families. We have such rich resources. Another question? Yes, sir.
Did you cover the Chinese and all of them?
I didn't have time. I did pick and research a Japanese family, the Kuroki family, and, you know, that's for another day. So invite me back, because I'd love to include them. Yes?
Yes, I'm curious how many people here are descendants of homesteaders in Nebraska?
Okay, how many people are descendants from homesteaders in Nebraska in this room? Homesteaders. Oh, wow, that's quite a few. I'm not. Mine came, but they bought their land. They didn't homestead. But, you know, a surprising thing was, at the Nebraska Historical Society, they have an online database of federal tract books, and you can plug things in. And I didn't think I'd find my people, because I thought, well, they came and they bought their land. You think you know. Never assume. Should I know that by my age? Yes. So I plug in my grandfather's name, Frederick Kreitz, and he comes up. And I'm thinking, well, he didn't homestead. It was a Timber Culture Act. So keep open to how and what land acts they were leveraging when they came here to settle. But it's actually kind of not as many as you'd think. Because again, a lot of people filed, but they didn't prove up. And a lot of people would say, oh, out on the homestead, they just meant their farmstead. So you actually have to dig in and see if the records exist. Any other questions? Do we have time for any more? Okay.
The map that you showed, Germany and those folks got to a port and then they got on a boat and then they came to America. And it seems to me as I dig through things, that's kind of important to know, where do I find resources like that? Because I need to know, where was Prussia? Was Prussia a county, or was it what was it, where was it?
Well, Prussia itself was huge and ever-changing. Oh, she's asking about resources for finding out where they were from, maybe which port they sailed from, where they arrived. I showed a little bit of that with some of the samples. There were emigration with an E records in the Germanic states. And some of those have been microfilmed by the Family History Library, and you can rent those microfilms and have them sent to our local history place. Some of them are digitized, and you can find them by going to either familysearch.org or Ancestry. A lot of the passenger lists are at Ancestry.com, and Heritage Quest too has some. Boy, that's a whole long thing. I could go on and on. Yes, Family Search is the Mormon one, and that is free to use because it's their mission. And Ancestry is rather pricey, but also a very rich and wonderful resource. But again, your public library has a library edition that you could use if you don't want to pay for it. The other thing is they might actually in their obituary or county history might leave you some clues as to, some people give the whole amount and some people say hardly anything, but you need to check all those. Naturalization records are another source, particularly 1907 and after. They have more information. They often will even say what town they were born in. I could go on and on. Any others? Any other questions? One more. Oh, this is a good question. I am so sorry that I talked about naturalization. To repeat her question, she said, what does naturalization mean? When you came from another country, you had to be naturalized before you could vote, and you had to be a citizen. With the Homestead Act, you had to be over 21 and a head of household, and either be a citizen or have the intent to become one. So a lot of homestead records will actually include a naturalization certificate because that was part of becoming a homesteader. But even those who didn't homestead, if they wanted to vote and have some of the rights of a citizen, they had to go through this process. Again, another thing that I could talk all day about, different naturalization laws which changed. But in general, they had to live here for 5 continuous years. And that first filing was their intent to naturalize. 5 years later, they could file their final papers. There were some exceptions. I'm not going to talk about those. But it just meant this is the process by which you become a citizen. And unlike today, they didn't have to take classes or anything. They just have to prove that they were, and if you broke the law and went to prison during your naturalization process, they weren't going to do the final papers. So for most of the time that we're talking here, again, they changed. And you want to look at those laws because sometimes people lie about things because they want whatever it is they want, including a pension or whatever. Any other questions? Very good. I really appreciate your taking the time to come down here on a hot day and find out a little bit more about the people who came here to settle. I hope I had a few things that surprised you.